So good morning and thank you very much for attending our symposium. I would like to begin thanking Nathalie for inviting us to organize this symposium. It's very nice to be here. I also want to thank my colleagues who enthusiastically accepted the invitation to be here. I want to begin by introducing my colleague Ana Margarida Abrantes, who organized with me this symposium. We're both from Católica. And I'm going to introduce one by one each of the photos you see here, because this is the order of our presentations. So just want to give you a brief overview of what we're going to talk about. We aim to bring contributions from several fields, from psychology, from ethology, from anthropology, from linguistics, into verbal and nonverbal signals and features of their production and processing in the overall experience of human communication, since, as evidence seems to point out, all these dimensions, even if remotely, they are connected, and even individual emotional traits punctuate both the production and the interpretation of signals. And language is not isolated from emotion, nor from culture, nor from context. So, we will start with an overview of what may be the functions of the so-called facial expressions, navigating through several perspectives of expression and decoding, as well as psychology perspectives that encompass the role of cultural, contextual, and individual variables that modulate expression and its interpretation. And that's going to be my talk. She's going to be the first talk and this overview. Then we continue with Cesar Lima. He's the second photo to your left. And he's going to talk about, can you hear me properly? Because it's very uncomfortable to be in this position. Although I could sit. He's going to talk about nonverbal vocalizations with a characterization of acoustic signals and their features, and he's going to talk about what is their interpretation when they're used as stimuli in experiments, and is going to approach individual differences to the perception of emotion. For example, detecting fake from spontaneous expression. Then we move to Francisco Esteves. He's the third, counting from your left. And he will provide evidence supporting the coevolution of threatening facial displays, their detection and decoding, reviewing research on the human ability to perceive and respond to those signals, perhaps the most relevant of all from an evolutionary perspective, threat. Then Carolina Maruta, she's the smiley face in the center. And she will delve on the neural architecture of language and of other cognitive functions, and through what brain lesions have been revealing, she will attempt to disentangle a bit language from other cognitive functions, and that's a task ever more difficult, as she will show you the more language impairment is observed to be correlated with reduced cognitive and affective outputs. Ana Mineiro, now we're counting from left, she's second from left, and she's right here by my side. She will report the research that followed the birth of a sign language, the São Tomé and Príncipe language, and this is a unique and extraordinary opportunity to extract clues to the evolution of language. Finally, Ana Margarida will reflect on the role of literature in emotion expression and elicitation, making an argument for the literary nature of humans as an ability, one may argue, has been constrained and perhaps promoted by the constants of human evolution. I'm very intrigued. Okay, so we move on to the first presentation, and if I can move up. There's a next. But it's a key. Well, it moved, but I don't want to have to do this every time. So I'm going to talk about cross-species facial expression, what's in an expression after all. I'm going to focus on the last part of the title. It's more my approach for today. And so I'm going to be talking about this very popular idea, very widespread in psychology, this idea that has actually dominated the last 40 decades in psychology and related areas, which is the notion that expression is a window to your state of mind. Sometimes people say window to the soul, but it's this idea that it's a window to your state of mind, that it translates what you're feeling. So when we talk about expression, we have to start from the beginning, and the first scientific approach to expression and this idea of having it translating a state of mind, emotion, goes back to Darwin, who was the first to approach this. When we look at studies of face perception, we know that we can extract many kinds of information from a face. Of course, we can extract species, we can extract age, we can extract unique identities from individual physiognomies. There's an individual physiognomy in every species, not just humans. And we can extract, sometimes accurately, health information, and we can extract information on the state of mind. Can we or can we not? That's the big question. And within the state of mind, we can talk about emotion, but state of mind, it's not just emotion, it's intentions, it's something that you are about to do. So these are the big issues. So when Darwin coined this notion of expression, and you know his very popular book, The Expression of Emotion in Man and Animals, he proposes the study of expression in a comparative and evolutionary view. He proposed that expression stems from other actions with other purposes. This is one of the big principles of expression, which is the principle of serviceable actions, which means that, for example, an expression of disgust could be related to constraining your nostrils and stopping toxic substances from entering your lungs. So Darwin posited that expression is an adaptive, it's adaptive, and this is very important. That's why I highlighted it in big letters. It's an adaptive group of actions, so it's a behavioral translation of this state of mind. And in his view, it was shaped by natural selection, just as any other trait, and it was adaptive to show your state of mind. So it was also adaptive to be able to have this ability to adequately interpret the state of mind of your interactor. So I think this is these are the pillars of the ideas that are going to be discussed. Something not as well known about Darwin's studies is that he started a kind of research that is still conducted today, which are experiments on facial expression perception. And he gathered a wide collection of photographs from Duchenne Boulogne, an anatomist that lived in the 19th century, he's contemporary. That's the man we see in the photo with the needles and the old man face. And this anatomist, Duchenne Boulogne, pioneered electromyography, facial electromyography, and he produced a number of photos. He was also a very ingenious photographer for his days. And so we have a large collection of photos of induced facial expressions from putting electric currents into the faces. So Darwin gathered these expressions, these photos, and he gathered a group of people in his house to be the judges of the meaning of these photos. So this was the first ever experiment on face perception. And he reports his findings in the book. And it's very interesting because he reports two things. One of the things that he reports are the consensus towards certain faces. Certain faces are extremely consensual, whereas others are not. And there is divergence. Why divergence? He tells this in his book. On the meaning of others. This is hardly ever mentioned about Darwin, but this is truly important for us here. So moving on to the 20th century with facial electromyography, another pioneer, still alive, Hoofdinberg, and in the mid-80s, he started these experiments with measuring what we can call invisible expressions, because these are reactions, muscle reactions from the muscles that produce facial expressions that are not necessarily visible to our eyes, but they represent changes in the activation of these muscles. So in one example of his studies, Dimberg measured some big reactions of zygomaticus major, that's the muscle that's responsible for the widest action when we smile, and larger reactions differentiating positive stimuli from negative stimuli. In another experiment, Dimberg with Monica Thunberg, they replicated this, but now using facial expressions, happy faces and anger faces and neutral faces for control. And again, they found that the muscles that were responsible for these actions, the zygomaticus for the smile and the corrugator, the muscle that produces our frown, were having larger activation towards similar expressions. So to the angry expressions, the corrugator would have a stronger response. And to your right, I chose to bring another study where you can see that this even happens when you're not aware that you're perceiving facial expressions. And so you can see that the circles are the responses to angry faces, but now here in one experiment where the angry faces and the neutral faces and the happy faces were presented for just a few milliseconds, so people were not aware that they were perceiving them, and then they were masked with neutral faces that were presented for a longer period of time, and that's the only thing people were aware that they were seeing. And again, you see the one that I marked in red, that's the corrugator response to angry faces, and again it's differentiating. Even though you're not aware that you saw the angry face, it's still responding to the angry face in a similar way as it would if the person was aware. So I think this comes in further support to the notion of the coevolution of expression and recognition posited by Darwin, and to the notion that expression portrays one's state of mind. It can be seen as favorable to this perspective. Now, this perspective was greatly developed by a group of researchers, beginning with Sylvian Tompkins and Paul Ekman, that's the person on the photo here to your left, and through a number of studies, they posited that there's a number of known facial expressions that translate discrete basic emotions, and so you see here 6 examples of what would be the prototypical facial expressions of certain discrete, very basic emotions, and I think you can recognize them, as did their participants for the most part. So importantly, they used actors to pose these expressions, and they had like 7 different options to label these emotions. So the 7th being none of them being neutral. Sorry. So they produced some evidence on convergence towards these interpretations, conducted several cross-cultural studies, and so you see several of the countries that were actually approached in this study. And for the most part, we talk about the consensus, of course, and all these numbers are consensus. The ones that I've marked in red are one, that's the, well, it's not exactly, that's the full part of my glass right now. So you see that in some instances you have 60% agreement. Now, 60% agreement, you can look at it as a 60% agreement, but you can also look at it as a 40% disagreement. And that's a lot of disagreement. And you see that's particularly concentrated in Japan, Hong Kong, but then also Germany, Estonia. So the smaller disagreements, they're sort of widespread. So I think this is an important angle to look at this. Now, when you have studies in naturalistic settings, so not with posed pictures, not by actors, when you have researchers, this is a very demanding task. Going into the field and recording natural facial expression, you have different results. And James Russell here to your left is perhaps, today there are many opponents to the idea that there are prototypical facial expressions to specific emotions, but perhaps James Russell has been the most outspoken. And he has proposed that emotion, expression, and instrumental behavior are independent things, and that they occur in intensities and combinations that are not necessarily the disruptive state we call emotion. So in a recent review that's in the book that you see here in the center, The Science of Facial Expression, he gathers many contributions on the diversity of contexts and triggers of facial and body expression, and on the multiplicity of content inferences from the face and body that people make in natural rather than laboratorial settings. And winning athletes, for example, Olympic athletes, Olympic winners, they have been one of the samples that has been studied by people who study naturalistic settings, because they're constantly being recorded. And so there's a lot of footage on what they do. And since you're expecting a prototypical facial expression of happiness when you receive the gold medal, we should make a match and a measurement of how many matches are there between this experience and the prototypical facial expression of joy. And they seldom occur. So that's very intriguing. Olympic athletes, they tend to cry, they tend to make, sometimes they look like angry faces, a myriad of combinations of action units, so a myriad of faces, and that has been one of the most quoted evidence that it's not exactly, the duos don't exactly occur for most of the time. So I decided to add into this, there's no data on Jorge Fonseca, but I decided to add our Olympic winner, very recent, when he won the World Championship of Judo in Tokyo this August. And he, again, does not produce exactly the happy facial expressions. So I thought it was neat to have this in our mind. So let's be fair, there is some match. There is partial match. And in a study, for example, to your left, that we conducted with 3-year-old children, again, in spontaneous occurrences, we have emotional context recorded, and we realized that the match was only 25% of the times for the expression, the prototypical facial expression that matched the most what we would be expecting. But again, the winner is happiness, but it's under 30%. So that's a match, but it's limited. When we look at the very recent meta-analysis that was conducted by Duran, Reisenzweig, and Fernandes-Dols, they gather a number of studies with spontaneous production of facial expression, and again they have matches, but they have small numbers. So for example, the prototypical facial expression of happiness matches happiness 27% of times, amusement a little bit more, and that's the best option you have, amusement, and that's very interesting. It made me think about laughter. The prototypical surprise face occurs 24% of the times there's surprise, and you can see the numbers and so on. And the prototypical facial expression of fear, only 11% of times. And when they looked, they have another measure of how many people were actually producing these prototypical facial expressions. The numbers are depressing. They go from 9% of participants to 20% of participants. So it's very modest. So there's something that is very limited here. Different account also with naturalistic studies that comes from anthropology and from people with a background in ethology, zoology, so forth, going through several cultures, has shown, for example, no matches between prototypical facial expressions and emotions, but some widespread patterns that we could call universal because they're cross-cultural, something like what you see in this photo, patterns of approach withdrawal, for example, in ambiguous situations, or patterns of ample movements, for example, displayed by people who are dominant in a given situation. So that's very interesting, but it's a completely different account. A different take on facial expression, it's looking at the observer's effects. What is it that observers put in the interpretation of emotions? And now Ursula Hess, she's working a lot in this regard. She's published several papers with her colleagues, and she has proposed that emotion expressions provide information both about the signaler and the situation. And it's been called the model of emotional expression in context. And the decoded content is also affected by observers' values, norms, attitudes, stereotypes, traits, goals, emotional states, all this sort of embedded in the context. I'll give you just one example of Hess and colleagues' studies. It's a study she conducted in Canada with people who actually live in the same country but have different cultural descent. So some Canadians of European descent were compared with Canadians of Asian descent. And they had to match smiles with different intensities, very high intense, average, and reduced intensity smiles. We do two types of facial configurations, the so-called Duchenne smile and the miserable smile, that have actually been characterized by Paul Ekman, whom we saw before. And they had to choose these smiles according to their appropriateness to convey three types of messages: appeasement, amusement, and dominance. And there are several kinds of differences that I don't have time to tell you. But for example, Canadians always prefer more intense smiles as being more adequate for the situation, whereas European Canadians and Asian Canadians prefer less intense smiles, but they find miserable smiles more adequate to appease, whereas there's no such preference, for example, in European Canadians. Another example, and I think this is a really, really neat example, it's very visual. It's also on the observer's effects. It's a line of experiments that has been conducted by Hillel Avizer, and what he does is, and he and his collaborators, is pick the prototypical facial expressions that have been validated across cultures for all those consensus, the posed facial expressions, and he places them in different contexts and bodies. And by doing that, they produce a very different effect. Now, this is, in this example, you have the facial expression of disgust, and to your left, there's the context of disgust. To your right, there's a context of pride. In the context of, the pointer is not really working, so I'll do what I do in classes. So, in the context of disgust, what do you see? I mean, there's a lot of agreement. It's 81%, but the same face placed over that body produces a 78% agreement with pride. So it's pretty much the same. There's not a big difference here, and 0% disgust for what we were used to think of as a very automatically triggering kind of stimulus. So I think this is very important kind of information. I'm about to finish just by saying that there are some associations. When we look at, for example, at other species and at our own, using the same methods, describing naturalistic behavior, taking a bottom-up approach, we find some matches. Of course we do, between certain emotional contexts and some expressions. But if you don't look for matches, what you find are associations between certain compositions of units. It's not a perfect match, and there are lots of individuals that are left out of it. So you have much more variation between groups than between species, which shows that it's not that prototypical, and you have individual variability that surpasses all these species patterns. And sometimes you find cross-species prototypes, but they seem to be in a very narrow range. Joy, playful context, that's the most recognizable, predictable, that occurs more times when you expect, and anger, but the anger studies, they don't all go in the same direction. So to conclude, prototypical facial expressions are generally unsupported by any close-up inspection of spontaneous facial behavior. Few exceptions occur for two types of emotion, but the emotion prototypical expression is presented only a minority of occurrences in individuals. It is perhaps, this is very speculative, a residual behavior from an ancestral and perhaps more predictable facial display, but for all I've said, probably before the split of the Homo pancreate. Expressive behavior is quite complex, rendering combinations of signals that vary across senders, cultures, contexts, and individuals, and whose processing and thus return practical meaning also depends on variation on the side of the perceiver. So it's, however, plausible that some perceivers are better decoders. That accounts for some of those fewer individuals that produce the matches, and for example, individuals with high empathy. But that's something that Cesar is going to be talking about, so I will not talk anymore about that. I just want to thank you for your attention. FCTU funded some of the research that was presented here, my co-authors, and tell you just a little bit of advice, take it if you want. For all I've said, do not believe very much in emoticons, because they're based on this, and this is probably the only emoji that you can trust, because it's the happy amusement one. Thank you very much.